So my topic today is property in space, and I'm going to be discussing first how one could get to a space economy, because there are different paths with different implications. Second, the general issue of why it makes sense for some things to be treated as property and some as commons. Third, applying those ideas to space, what things it makes sense to treat as property in space. And then there's no point in defining something as property if there's no way of enforcing the rule. So what can be enforced and how can it be enforced in space? So those are my topics today. Uh, Let me start with the two general different ways one might end up with a space economy. One of them is if you have some cheap way of getting between Earth and space, which at the moment we don't have, such as a space elevator is the standard, clever, maybe unworkable way of doing it. And that would give you an economy closely linked to Earth, where people were going up and down routinely, stuff was going up and down routinely, and so forth. If you can't do that, so far we can't, the alternative is to bootstrap, to use the present expensive methods in order to get a few people, tools, maybe a reactor into space, put it on an asteroid, mine the asteroid, build stuff with that material, repeat with a very small trickle of people and material coming up for Earth. You are not ever going to lift a large population off Earth at present costs, but we have a well-developed, established technology for producing people, and given time and a starting population in space, you could use natural reproduction to build the population. And you then end up with an economy that has very little connection to Earth. Most people on Earth will never get off it. Most people in space will never visit Earth. And that has rather different implications, not so much for what ought to be property ideally, as for what property rights would be practical to enforce. Let me discuss the general issue of property versus commons. We're all familiar with property, a person or an organization. I'm not going to be distinguishing between private property and government property at this level of analysis. Owns something, can control how it is used, and can transfer the ownership. That's sort of the standard set of institutions we're used to. The alternative is a commons. A commons, there is no owner. Anybody can use it who can get at it, basically. There are lots of examples of that in our society. Most ideas and information in our society are not treated as intellectual property, but it's commons. The English language itself is a commons. You don't have to pay a licensing fee to use a word, even if some identifiable person invented that word and propagandized it. Seawater is a commons. You can draw as much of it out as you like. In many societies, wild animals, the hunt are a commons. To some extent, they are in our society. And in some societies, sometimes much of the land was commons. So those are the two alternative systems for controlling stuff, basically. And what is the trade-off between them? The benefit of treating things as property is there are really two basic ones. The first is that if something has to be produced, the fact that the producer will own it gives him an incentive to produce it and to maintain it, to take care of it. A car that anybody could use is likely to be in poor shape and empty of gas next time you want to use it. Furthermore, you've got to find some way of deciding who uses something. Might makes right is a pretty expensive way of doing that. So if you have things in limited supply, property is a mechanism for allocating them to their highest value use, because the owner can rent them or sell them to whoever values them more. But there are costs as well, which is why we don't, in fact, treat the English language as property, why many things are commons. First, in order to have a property system, you have to monitor who is using it and enforce the owner's control over it. That is not costly, and in some cases, it can be very expensive. Furthermore, in order that anybody other than the owner can use it, you have to have a transaction. If you imagine the case where what you want to do is to translate an out of print work by an author no longer alive, and you have to get copyright permission, merely finding the owner could be quite costly. And then you've got to negotiate with the owner to get it. So those are there's the third one, which is a little less obvious. And that is if you are trying to propertize something that already exists, such as land, then individuals are going to compete to get it. Their land is valuable. And if you're giving it away, there are going to be lots of takers. You get land by being the first settler under a homesteading system. That leads to a claims race, to premature settlement, as people settle land at a point when farming it is a loss, but by farming it, they get eventual ownership. The solution to this problem suggested by the economists who first raised it is to auction the land off. But as I think I've shown elsewhere, that also raises a set of problems, though I'm not going to discuss them here, given the brief length of this talk. Then the question of whether or not something ought to be property ends up, as you would see from this, depending on the trade-off between the costs and the benefits of treating it as property. If something already exists, that's an argument against treating it as property. That's the homesteading problem. If it is not scarce, such as seawater, there's no need to allocate use, no reason to. If it's hard to monitor it, that's an argument against. And of course, the opposite of each of these arguments against is an argument for. Examples, land already exists, which is an argument against, but it is scarce, which is an argument for. Monitoring its use is easy for farmland. You can see who's growing stuff on it. Not so easy if you've got to see who is hunting across your vast forest. Writings have to be created. So that's an argument for treating them as property. But once created, a writing is not scarce. Two people can read the same book at the same time as long as they have different copies. So that's an argument against. Enforcement for print books that have to be printed in large quantities. It's relatively easy to monitor and enforce copyright. For digital books, it's much harder. So those are some examples of the general issues. Let me now go on to the case of property in space. Space itself, empty volume up there, is in quite plentiful supply, and it's already there, so it's not scarce. However, there are some parts of space which are scarce, and therefore for which property rights make a good deal of sense. And the obvious one at the moment is geosynchronous orbit, which is already getting crowded. James may know what the relevant rules are. I don't. I'm really a theorist, not a student of current law. But you can see that it would be desirable to have some mechanism. So if I've got a satellite in geosync and it's really no longer of much use to me, I've got an incentive to somehow bring it down and sell that chunk of orbit to somebody else who wants to put one there without running into anything else. Move a little bit farther forward in time to the point at which we have space habitats and L4 and L5, the Lagrange points of the Earth-Moon system, which are stable positions where if you put something that stays there, then become potentially scarce and valuable property, and somebody may want to own them. Go farther, much farther into the future and start thinking in terms of a Dyson sword around the sun. We have a nice thermonuclear reactor conveniently located a mere 92 million miles from here. Why waste any of its output once we've got the kind of space civilization that can use it? And now solid angle on the sun becomes a valuable resource, and you're going to want ideally to have rules that will keep you from putting a solar cell satellite where it's shading my solar cell satellite. This is already a real issue on Earth, both with solar cells and with hotels who don't want their swimming pool shaded by other hotels. Those are real legal cases. What about solid stuff, asteroids and moons? On the one hand, there are a lot of them, but information on which ones are worth mining is going to be valuable. If the valuable ones are scarce and the information is cheap, then you're back with the homesteading problem. And that would be an argument for auctioning off ownership. This is the first point in this talk where I get to the idea in the chapter about using this to give people capital so they can survive after we're all unemployed due to robots, which is an interesting set of ideas, but not one I've thought a lot about. On the other hand, if the information is expensive, it's got to actually go there and drill holes in the asteroid and such to find out what's there, then it makes sense to treat it as the property of the first discoverer, rather like a mining claim. All right. Then the next issue which arises is what rights can be enforced and how can they be enforced. So one possibility is by courts on earth if the economies are closely linked. That was my first path, because then you could have some organization, possibly something like the UN, possibly a state. You might have a state which has some sort of a first mover advantage for controlling space. The obvious one would be the state that controlled the space elevator if there were one. Past examples of that pattern of a single state imposing in effect international law with the abolition of the slave trade in the 19th century by the UK, and the Monroe Doctrine, also in the 19th century by the US. Maybe some kind of a space government will develop. I'm not sure that's very likely or even desirable, but it's certainly a possibility. And then you might have court enforcement in space. More interesting to me are the mechanisms by which you might have privately enforced property rights, of which there are lots of historical examples. Again, people can look at my legal system's very different look if they're curious about that sort of stuff. One current example are trade secrets. Trade secret law makes it easier to protect trade secrets, but trade secrets long predate trade secret law. You just don't tell anybody. That's a way of maintaining your property right. Information on what is on an asteroid starts out as a trade secret, but once you start mining it, others can see it. And so you might need legal enforcement of some sort. Or maybe the fact that you're on the asteroid gives you a military advantage, the first mover. You've got lots of rock to hide behind if people are throwing things at you, and lots of rock to throw at other people. So maybe taking a spaceship and being the second lander on a asteroid already being exploited is going to be a losing deal. Finally, there is a possibility that I find particularly interesting. This, again, I've written about, which is a system of rights enforced by a mutually recognized set of commitment strategies. And the example of this is territorial behavior in animals. That there are quite a lot of number of animals where one individual marks out the territory he is claiming and somehow turns a switch in his brain. And that's the way I like to think of it, such that he will fight more and more desperately against the trespasser of his own species and gender, the farther the trespasser comes in. A fight to the death is usually a loss for the winner as well as the loser. So if you recognize that commitment strategy, you don't trespass. It does not work perfectly, but it does work. My standard human example is the Falklands War. The UK was willing to spend much more than the islands were worth in order to demonstrate that it was committed to fight pretty hard against anybody who tried to seize its territory. That kind of mechanism can work, provided that everybody knows who owns what, hence who will fight for what. It does not require any moral belief in ownership. It does not require any legal structure of ownership, but it does require a shared perception of this is your stuff, which you'll fight for. This is my stuff that I'll fight for. I won't fight very hard to take your stuff because it's not worth doing. And similarly, the other way around. So that gives a further possibility for how you can enforce property rights in space. What else? Are there other things we might want to propertize? Spaceships and space habitats raise issues we're already familiar with. They're ordinary owned property objects. Presumably a habitat will also have rules internally within it for its inhabitants, but I'm not really discussing that. Planets raise issues similar to asteroids and moons. Why haven't I talked about planets? Because once you've climbed out of a well, it doesn't make a lot of sense to jump down to another one. What am I missing? I don't know, but some of you may have suggestions for other sorts of things that would make sense to treat as property. And then the final question, which I'm not going to offer an answer, is what if someone else is out there? What if at some point we encounter another spacefaring species, which could happen, but probably not in this solar system? I've written up a much longer version of this talk and webbed it. It is part of a collection of chapters that on a wide variety of things that I intend to eventually turn into one or more books. And it's on my webpage if people want to look at it. And that's the URL. And I will leave that URL up for a little bit and stop talking. Thank you.
Wow, fantastic. You really covered it all. Um, if you don't mind, would you mind sharing the URL maybe in the chat as well? That would be
Sure.
really helpful. Otherwise, I can try to Google it. But
Just a minute.
thank you. Okay, awesome. Um, thank you so much. Okay, lovely. And I think, interestingly, like Rowan Hansen gave the talk really at the beginning of this year on very aliens. So it's like, okay, when could we meet other people who are out there? People, whatever, entities that are out there. Okay, I think before we hop into a Q&A, let's have Jim do this contribution, and then we can just, maybe have a little bit more of a back and forth, because I already see lots of comments in the chat. Okay, Jim, if you want to tell us a little bit more on the practical side, on legal considerations for outer space exploration and development, we would love to hear from you. And I'll share your bio in the chat.
Okay. Can everyone hear me? So,
Very well.
first of all, compliment David on his excellent basic discussion of property rights, and I think you do have to start with the basic idea: why do we have property rights at all, and what are the pros and cons of it? And he had some very astute points about there are areas where common goods make sense, and there's areas where property makes sense, and there's kind of a gray zone in between, which has been the source of most conflict in human history, or at least competing titles to property, and that have been the source of a lot of conflicts. So resolving these issues beforehand with a rational system or an understandable system can probably save a lot of trouble in the long term. Most of my comments are going to be on as a reaction to my first reading of the chapter that you posted on the universal basic income and inheritance day, and some of the issues that that raises and how they interact with the whole concept of property. First of all, I just want to make a few comments about scenarios for how space might develop, because they're a bit different from David's. And since it hasn't actually happened, we can all argue about which one is more plausible, but we won't know until something actually happens. So without denigration of anybody else's model, what I'm looking at, first of all, I think within 24 months, we will have it demonstrated whether we're going to lower the cost of getting people and cargo to orbit by maybe 2 orders of magnitude, i.e. when Super Heavy and Starship fly, if it performs as advertised, or reasonably so. That's a revolution right there. I mean, most of the things that space advocates have been talking about for the last 50 or 60 years have always depended on, well, when we get low cost to orbit, we can do X, Y, Z. We're about to get that. So we had better be prepared for the consequences. Secondly, there's an intermediate step between spaceships and space elevators, which I think is probably going to happen fairly soon. I mean, there's one system under test right now, which is some kind of vast accelerator from Earth, which would require only a small upper rocket stage to circularize the orbit. Spin Launch is building a test article of this right now at Spaceport America. We'll know again in a few years how well that works. If you have that, then any mass that can stand high acceleration, and I'm talking, 10,000 Gs or something, can be sent to orbit extremely cheaply, like dollars per pound. You send people in the Starship, you send everything else by accelerator, and you have a pretty good system there. And as to what you can put under 10 Gs acceleration, look at smart artillery shells that have proximity fuses or other devices which pull up to 30,000 Gs at the time they're fired. So we already have a lot of experience with high G non-living mass acceleration. So that is going to allow us to do a great deal of stuff in low Earth orbit pretty cheaply. I like Tom Murata and Al Globus's concept of putting the most activity in equatorial low Earth orbit habitats, O'Neill type habitats, but about 500 or 600 miles straight up, because you are still within the Earth's radiation shield, so you don't have to worry about radiation shielding mass. If you have an equatorial orbit, you don't go over the South Atlantic anomaly, which is where most radiation exposure occurs in low Earth orbit. So the nice thing about that is these habitats don't actually have to be self-sustaining. They can be dependent on accelerated launch of food, water, oxygen, whatever you want. They should rerun the Biosphere 2 experiment with unlimited water and oxygen and see what happens that way. Although launching food is going to be so cheap, it will be compressed a little because of the G's, but it'll be like kind of like freeze-dried meat or something. Um, but you don't have those constraints where, oh, the self-sufficiency doesn't work, we die in a month. So that's gonna change. As to what people will do there economically, well, it's going to be within what I call the connective sphere, the area in which you can have non-time delayed communication up and down. And we have the bandwidth for that now. And we've just run a 2-year experiment in how people can earn a living if they can't meet face to face. It turns out about 50% of the population right now, with zero preparation or adjustment time, manage to operate as if they were in low Earth orbit. So Leo is this kind of golden interface between the connective sphere and zero gravity and the rest of the universe. You're outside of the gravity well. You can send ships to the asteroids and back, bring the material and use them in Leo. At the same time, you're on the phone talking to your best friend down on Earth, or having your business meetings, or having a meeting like this. I could have a meeting like this from Leo and you would barely notice the difference. Actually, it's better than using a geosynchronous orbit relay. There's less time lag. By the way, the question to who allocates to spectrum is it should be called the World Administrative Radio Conference of the International Telecommunications Union. And it's a good example of a terrible way to divide a commons and try to make pseudo property out of it, especially because it's like one entity, one slot allocation is the system. So like the Isle of Man, which is technically an independent government, has an allocation. Tonga has an allocation. They have been very clever about selling these effectively on the world market. And you're going to have this problem in any kind of equal distribution, which is who counts as equal. And that gets into some of the issues in the inheritance day UBI. And I say issues, not problems, because maybe there's solutions. I don't discount that we might be able to resolve some of the issues here, but they have to be considered. Number one is, physical, as David alluded to this, physical title requires defense. It requires enforcement. We don't have a world sovereign. We're not going to have one any time in the foreseeable future. So you can either say individual countries can enforce the title of their own citizens, even if you distribute it globally, which is great for Americans, Chinese, and Russians, not so great for everyone else in the world. So that's not going to fly, at least without some adjustments. The other way to do it is that you need to be plugged into the world economy. You need to be able to sell your shares of your company on world markets. You need to, all sorts of interact with the banking system. You need a connection there. And we could say we will deny that connection to anybody who doesn't play along with this right system. If you could get a multilateral agreement with that among the G7 economies, you're most of the way there. I predict China will do its own thing, go its own way, and ignore the international economy. And so we're just going to have to expect that. There's going to be a couple other people with capability and a disinclination to participate in international systems. And my suggestion is, let the wiki win there. We just have to, we have to design our system around the idea that there's got to be some holdouts, just like the way Japanese have probably the most absolute property system in the modern world. They don't have eminent domain to any real degree. When you have a holdout, they just build around them. And we're going to have to accept that. If we give up on universality, we can do a great deal more than if we wait for universality to be achieved. And I think that, monitoring it at the point of connection with the international global system is the more effective way, and doesn't require that you build a huge space navy, which taxpayers mostly won't code for. The second thing is that whatever system you come up with can't burden exploitation too much. For one thing, if you have this accelerator system going, space resources, at least for the first 20, 30, maybe 50 years, are going to have to compete very strongly against cheap, lunar water, for instance, has always been talked about as the first thing likely to be exploited. It's going to have to compete against accelerator launch ice from Earth, and that's going to be pretty cheap. So before you build this big infrastructure to mine ice on the moon and send it to a LowEarth Orbit to be used, you're going to have to invest quite a bit of money, and maybe someone will figure out how to make accelerators cheaply in the meantime. So you have genuine competition for quite a while. If you artificially burden the price of those extraterrestrial resources, you just delay the development of them, and I'm not sure there's any particular good public reason to do that. So whatever method of giving this dividend from extraterrestrial resources, it shouldn't be just a big tax or fee that you lay on it at the beginning, or a purchase price that you have to lay to some distributed owner, no matter how you create that ownership. So those are some of the biggest issues. A couple other things in fairness. Headcount, on one hand, seems really fair, but you need to do it almost instantaneously at the beginning. You can't give people the idea that, oh, gee, if my country breeds a lot more people real quickly, we'll get a lot more dividends from the headcount. If you look at Emmanuel Todd's work on population and decline, the most certain way to reduce your rate of population growth is to educate women. Conversely, the best way to depress it is to deprive women of education. You don't want to give any state incentive to do that. So headcount has some big question marks to it. I'm getting to the end here. I'll just say the other security issue is if you give out some kind of universal grant or benefit to everybody in the world, what's going to happen in the PRC? I think what's going to happen is you're going to be expected to turn it in, maybe they'll have a fig leaf like saying, well, we're going to have this China National Space Corporation, and you will exchange your share of titles in return for some shares in the China National Space Corporation, which may or may not ever have a dividend. And, as long as people aren't, completely free actors, you're going to deal with state authorities seizing the dividend. So, UBI off of natural resource dividends, and in theory, it's a pretty good system. It works well in Alaska, but Alaska is a first world state with a pretty good constitutional rights situation and strong property rights. And you're not going to have that globally. So we just need more thinking on that. Allison, am I out of time yet?
If you have another one, go for it. You're on a roll.
Those were the main things. I have to add that if you are going to have a UBI system, I like the idea of a natural resource dividend. But like I say, it can't, if you burden exploitation of it too much, you're self-defeating. And especially with space resources, you're always competing against Earth resources. And Earth resources are far from finished, especially as you get down to technology. You might be able to get a lot of resources, say, out of molecular sieving of seawater or some other method, which would be quite competitive with space-derived resources for a long time. Historically, I'll just leave it with this thought. We are really burdened in our way of thinking because we're just beyond the end of a 10,000-year period of human history, which I call the Great Land Hunger. Right? From the early Neolithic, people began to understand that the best way of assuring, personal security, food security, community security is to own farmable land. and to have the densest possible population on that land in order to defend it from your neighbors. Because historically, any more dense population of farmers has always seized and converted the less densely populated land of its neighbors. And this is just it's pretty solid record of this happening over the last 10,000 years. We look at the last couple hundred years in North America or, Australia, or you should be looking at Manchuria and Hokkaido too, but because it happened there. But that's just what happens when the more densely populated people also develop technology and can accelerate the rate of absorption of the land around there. Right. And that ended somewhere between 1880 and 1920, at least using the US as a leading indicator, when for the average person, you were better off materially, socially, and in many other ways, moving to the city and taking an industrial job. Even though early industrial revolution jobs weren't wonderful by our standards, they were better than working a farm with hand labor for 16 hours a day. So you started getting the move from, we started out at the time of the revolution as, I think, 97% agricultural. And by the end of the 19th century, it was 50-50. And now it's like, I think under 1% are engaged in agriculture, and the farmlands, the big farmlands, say on the Great Plains, are emptying out of people, yet they produce more food than ever because the automation of farming, and which is going to continue. So this dynamic of property being like land in some way is coming to an end. Our instincts haven't caught up with this yet, and our political thinking hasn't caught up with that yet. And that's, it's not going to be that way in space. We're not going to go to Mars to farm Mars, although we're going to have to grow food or produce food in some way on Mars. But that's probably going to continue to be a small fraction of the total population doing it. On the other hand, I also believe in the picture that Freeman Dyson painted in Infinite in All Directions, where he observed that most settlement has been by individual initiative, and people go there because for one reason or another, they want to go there. And I think that's going to continue in space. I think Elon Musk happens to have come across this in his own thinking. They're saying, well, what I want to do is create a system where anybody who can get $500,000 together can get a fare to Mars, or fare to Mars for their family, and some kind of habitation that's halfway decent. So,
all right,
that area, you'll probably see people going to Mars just because they like flat land and horizons, and they have these, instincts. Colonists tend to colonize first the land that's most like the place they left. So, people from England went to the parts of North America that looked like England and made it look more like England. And after a while, that was less important. And so I think we're going to get most of the population is going to be in neo-habitats, the way Globus and Narada described. You're going to have a non-trivial population on Mars, sort of almost like role-playing settlers.
Yeah.
A bunch of Texans who will go to great length and expense to create tented areas where they can raise cattle, but because
Okay.
they do.
Well, I mean,
These things have got to be taken into account when you're thinking about Inheritance Day.
Thank you so much. You have opened up a box of Pandora of considerations. I think if you want the Mars guys, you can go to San Francisco a few times during the year when like wildfires is, and it's already like pretty daunting. But I think like those terrible issues aside, like I think David had a few comments already. One on your enforcement, and then David already distinguished between yours and his version, and especially how what would happen if the US and China actually geared up to want to establish claims as well. So David, maybe you can make a few comments to what Jim just said, and if anyone wants to chime in, raise your hand so I can monitor what left to the chat versus what's for the discussion.
James is really just offering a more plausible version of my first path. That is to say, I take the space elevator as sort of the limiting case. It's a really neat technology if we can ever do it. But it may well be, he certainly knows more about it than I do. It may well be that with something much closer to our present technology, we can get low enough costs to do it. I guess that would be my main response. And, if so, I hope he's right. I'm not sure I had any other comments. I've put up in the chat links for people who are interested in my idea of commitment strategies, which I've been arguing for some time are what really underlie all societies. That's the mechanism that keeps us out of the Hobbesian state of nature. And I've discussed that in an old piece, which is there's a link on my blog, on the sidebar of my blog to it. And I've discussed it more recently in the third edition of my first book, where I have 2 chapters, which one of them is sort of setting the framework, and then one which is a positive account of rights. That I think of rights in that sense, not as a legal or moral category, but as a description of how people behave. And so I'm not sure I have anything more to say. James' ideas are interesting. He's thinking his initial talk was thinking mostly in the fairly short range when we're still all close to Earth. And I agree that's certainly a possibility as a sort of an intermediate stage. And the later part is sort of more interesting. One other point that is worth making if we're thinking a century or a century and a half from now is that if nothing goes wrong, average real incomes are going to be very much higher. Things could go wrong, but the general trend, if you think about how much richer we are than people even a century and a half ago, I've been reading Pepys' diary, which is quite fascinating. One of the things is Pepys is reasonably well off, sort of upper middle class person. He's an important naval official. He routinely shares a bed with another man who he has no particular emotional relationship with, because there aren't enough beds, basically. If another woman comes to, well, let me not go into details, but it's just sort of neat seeing how much poorer 17th century England, which was a pretty prosperous society, was. And if we have the kind of society where the average person has an income of $10 million a year, then using our current technology of slightly improved versions to take Christmas trips to space becomes much more viable.
All right. I think, one thing that I just want to preface with before we get to the next comment is that, all of the things that we're discussing are really, really hard questions. In the chapter, we basically quote Jan Tallinn in what he said about a problem in which humans in a thought experiment would encounter an alien fleet. And he says, even if we could secure just one galaxy out of the 100 billion as consolation prize for the losers, this would translate into 50 personal star systems for every human alive today. This illustrates 2 things. One, even if we mostly screw up, things might turn out to be pretty okay in the end. And second, the worst we can do is continue our current political zero-sum game, which cuts us 50 galaxies per second. So this is, I think, just to say that, the details are really, really hard to figure out. But there's a lot to gain potentially. And with that preface, I think Mark had another comment, and then I'll take questions again from the chat.
Yeah. First of all, I love both of these talks, and I love how well they fit together, and I love how well both of them explore a lot of the problematic aspects of what we're proposing with the Inheritance Day. As we wrote the chapter, we were very aware that this is a very, very problematic proposal, and I love that you guys are both exploring and deepening what the issues are of any approach like this. The particular question I have is for Jim, with regard to what you said about geostationary orbit and about how we did it with a equal distribution of initial rights that included like the Isle of Man as a equal recipient, but that the result was that they could sell it and that they've been very good about selling it. That seems to me like a almost completely perfectly positive outcome. And I'll invoke the Coase theorem with regard to it, which is I think what that, yeah, I don't know anything about it other than what you said, but assuming that the property rights abilities to buy and sell and trade these things after the initial allocation are working well, it sounds like this shows that it doesn't matter to a very wide extent how weird or wrong or questionable the initial allocation is, that as long as you can trade from there, the trade will reallocate to the appropriate uses. So, is this not almost a perfectly positive example?
Well, it certainly didn't benefit the people of the very large states who only got a couple of slots themselves.
If it's so much more valuable to the people of the large states, then starting from that initial allocation, wouldn't uh, pricing and trade reallocated according to that differential benefit?
Mm, One of the problems is that the governments haven't been perfect actors. Uh, the yeah, one of the things about the little Pacific Islands getting allocations is that they weren't even aware that they had a valuable resource. A bunch of lawyers came in from first world countries and talked them into basically very bad deals, whereby the lawyers and their shell companies got most of the benefit from it, which again shows the problem with just random distribution and assuming all parties are equally well-informed actors.
Okay, just one more follow up, and then we can go to the next person. The so Can we divide up the problem into two sub problems? One is what the initial allocation is, and the other one is whether the decision makers that those initial allocations are left with are decision makers who one can expect to rationally respond to market incentives on the part of the constituents they represent.
Yeah, I would accept that.
Okay.
There's also just another point that Russia, for instance, or the Soviet Union at the time, which came out low on the allocations, put a lot more resources into non-geosynchronous satellite communication methods. So there was a competing, which are not rationed at all. Um, so even that allocation of resources was subject to competition from substitution.
Okay. Well, I'm asking you guys to interrupt me in case you have a question by just raising your hand, because I'm not exactly always sure what in the chat should make it in here. So just raise your hand if you want to say something out here. One thing that we walk through three problems that we see, and there's many more. One is the distribution, and we argue for something like a gradual relief via something like a trust. The second one is property rights, so the problem of really dividing up the pie. And then the third one is the legitimacy. So, can we have even, how would it look like if we have competing title registries and so forth, right? To me, almost the second one of dividing up the property rights almost seemed the hardest. And I think we haven't talked very much about this yet. Maybe do you have any ideas here on, we propose basically just two strategies of how we may be able to figure out a better rights division. One is by copying something like the wealth management funds that Poland used when they privatize their market economy. And then the other one is by doing kind of cake cutting game-like strategies or simulation thereof. Do you have any idea of, how we may get around to a better property rights division that is appropriate for space resources?
That's always been the big problem in any of these UBI schemes. And ones linked to physical resources are particularly problematic. Alaska, again, they just did an equal distribution based off of a, basically resource tax that was easy to collect and it was easy to assure fairly equitable distribution. Again, because you had a constitutional democracy with a pretty well functioning legal and court system. There's no way to get this where the a global system. So that's one of the reasons why I'm kind of skeptical about resource-based global UBI schemes, even though I think they're attractive in the theoretical aspect. I will certainly continue to think about it.
David, do you have any comment?
No, I was interested to hear from James that we may be closer to having a viable near space civilization than I thought. I hope he's right. I'm a little curious about the accelerators. Is this using magnetic acceleration or?
Yeah. Look up Spin Launch. I think the Spin Launch LLC and see what they're doing. But there's a whole bunch of different.
Because it's an old science fiction idea. I mean, after all, in Moon is the Harsh Mistress, that's what they're using to throw rocks down at Earth.
And you remember at the end, one of the resolutions was the Earth pledging to create an accelerator system on Earth to lower the cost of transporting goods to the moon, which is, I mean, right now we have to pay more attention to the off-Earth aspects of the problem. And, you do have a problem because you're not shooting in a vacuum, but there's solutions. Some of them involve. Well, I think I have to build it in Bolivia on a high altiplano. So
do you have to worry about the potential military use of these? If you are good enough, you throw things up on an orbit where they're going to come down again, and they're going to hit pretty hard.
They're well, you can also put warheads on them. So
I was just going back to Heinlein where all we have to do is to throw rocks, and thinking of the equivalent of that for this technology.
Yeah, kinetic weapons. And actually, in the last couple of decades in wars, we've found that dud ammunition that doesn't go off does almost as much damage as ammunition that does go off. One of the ships lost in the Falklands on the UK side was hit with a missile whose warhead failed to explode, but there was still fuel left in the rocket and it continued to burn, which set the superstructure on fire. So yeah, kinetic weapons are a genuine issue. On the other hand, they are vulnerable to counterfire because we know with absolute precision where the launch is coming from.
Yes, right.
Mobile rocket launchers would have the same effect and would be much harder to guard against because they're mobile.
I guess just because I read science fiction, I'm now imagining a plot where you use your accelerator to launch lots and lots of things, one after another. And it's only when the first one comes down, people realize what you're doing. By that time, it's too late to take out the accelerator.
Yeah, there's been some thinking in the military about bundled kinetic weapons. They would just be a long series of basically lances that you drop from orbit, and they're called rods from God.
Crowbars from space was the term that I remember a long time ago on that issue.
Same thing.
I think Jerry Cordell said that, if I remember.
Mark Stigler also had a story with that.
Yeah.
And the Americans didn't want Canada to be the world's largest space power, so it was nixed.
Well, we're terrified.
Yeah. I want to explore the issue of commitment strategies and the degree to which automated weapon systems and in general automation can create credible commitments. And just to sort of seed the conversation, mentioning three examples. One is Dr. Strangelove. Why build a doomsday machine and not tell anybody about it? The whole nuclear deterrence thing relies on a commitment, which is that after a first strike, it's probably not in the interest to launch a second strike, but it's in the interest to be credible that you would. But that's a very, very dangerous game to play. As
that was the point of the doomsday machine, of course. The doomsday machine was to be offered as a simplified version of what we already had. And one problem which that raises, which I don't think people discuss much, is if you're the last engineer out of the doomsday machine cave, the last thing you do is to cut the cable because you never want it to go off. So you have the problem of how, when you build such a thing, you convincingly persuade the other side that it's real.
Okay. Then the other two things I just, to seed the conversation, is in the world of blockchain, where it's not an issue of robotics and it's not an issue of automated use of violence, but it is an issue of simply the kind of Tom Schelling value of commitment to follow through on something that might not be in your interest to follow through in that way at the time. Blockchain shows that the inspectability, the public inspectability, and the lack of control once set in motion is a tremendously powerful game theoretic tool for engaging in credible commitments and getting the benefits of that. And then the third one I just want to mention, going back to the issue of robotics and automated threats of violence, is the day the Earth stood still, where where it's explained, where the alien explains to the Earthlings that, look, you're already in a system in which we have deployed a robotic police force and thrown away the key, and it's going to enforce a basic set of punishment for violence, violent punishment for violence, and neutrality otherwise, and no one can stop it at this point. And that's, and unlike Dr. Strangelove, that one's portrayed in a positive way. So just, I don't have a particular question. I just wanted to sort of seed more of a discussion with those as anchor examples for how one proceeds to do automated commitment with regards to this kind of property enforcement.
One problem with that is that the kind of system I'm working on depends on there already existing a perception, a set of Schelling points, such that I can't just say, well, I'm committed to take your stuff. That's not believable, whereas I'm committed to keep you from taking my stuff is believable. And if you're programming your commitments into computer-guided weapons or something, it's not clear how you're going to get the equivalent of that. And that's a potential problem.
Well, and another thing is that a game like that between superpowers is relatively evenly managed, whereas what we're expecting in space is a lot of people sending up, small spaceships for a small community, and they're going to have a hard time fighting off the larger powers or credibly committing to be able to do anything if somebody tries to take it over.
Topic that just came up in the chat is that David Friedman's assumption that the doomsday machine wouldn't work because the last engineer would disable it assumes that the engineer is a totally rational actor, which is a decidedly modernist bias. And so I think that in today's engineering schools, many agents wouldn't ask such questions because this would have to be decided by an ethics committee or whatever. And this is all institutionalized and committeeized, and we don't have these agents anymore. And I wonder if there are criteria that let us quantify and predict the rationality of collective agents. So there are reasons why many institutions stopped in the second or third generation to be rational agents or to behave as collective rational agents. And I suspect that's because individual rationality in the organizational hierarchy has taken over. And it's often something that we don't take into account when we try to model collective agents at scale, that the incentives for rational agency at the different levels are not uniform, and that they change over time, and that they should predict how rational an agent can afford to act as a collective.
Yeah, my standard definition of market failure is situations where individual rationality doesn't produce group rationality.
So will the rules be greatly different in space, though? I mean, on the Earth, basically, if you're a superpower, nobody can attack you, and you can pretty much do what you want. And if you're not a superpower, they don't tend to attack you unless you try and conquer Europe or do, sort of thing which gets above whatever threshold. And in space, won't it be the same? If you have someone who's so dominant in space that the rest of the players cannot get in and discipline them, won't that player be able to do whatever they want?
to begin with, being able to do whatever you want may be against your interest. This is again a commitment issue. That if the circumstances are such that the efficient way of mining asteroids is not to have a big corporation hire employees to do it, but to have a bunch of crazy, miner types go out at considerable risk, then even if there were a single agency which had power, it has an incentive to somehow try to commit itself not to use that power to grab your asteroid as soon as you found it, or as soon as you started mining.
But if it feels it's in their interests to grab but it's not going to be humans, it's going to be robots doing this, I suspect. But whoever's doing it, if it's in the power's interest to take the asteroid, what stops them?
What I'm saying is that the power may itself has an incentive to try to set up things to stop them in order to credibly commit not to take it.
Well,
I guess part of the thing.
the other conflict is between smaller groups. And unlike on Earth, you aren't in somebody's geographic territory who has an incentive to protect your rights. And so it's on you to protect your rights. And now with a lot of smaller competing interests, being able to have theft and whatever between them is a problem.
Yeah, I mean, if we have to protect our own individual rights, that's a little bit of a Wild West situation, which is not the most productive and conductive situation for commerce and everything else.
There is a book called The NotSoWild Wild West, however, which explores the difference between the proverbial Wild West and the real one.
I'm using the metaphor of Wild West. I'm not using the real.
Yeah, but since the real Wild West was more or less the situation you're describing, how it turned out is better evidence than the proverbial version.
And, I guess I would just point people to, I think it's in the third chapter when we introduce intelligent voluntary cooperation, and we introduce a few dynamics that that agents could put in place, and they are still very decentralized, that would ensure multipolarity, or at least make it more likely that the system stays multipolar over the long run, including the compensating dynamics, such as were likely used by the Teserverse failure, where that's actually it's in others' interest to actually credibly commit that they won't go out, and even if they do, then there's active incentives that make others stand together and stop them. So I think it depends a little bit, I guess, on the initial setup and then on the dynamics that are put in place. And that's a part of the thing that we were trying to do with that chapter, is to set up the initial conditions at least a little bit more favorably than they would be in the default. Okay, we're now on time. Thank you so much for joining us today. We had a crazy wild walk, and one person, at least, I'm going to share this with you, asked me, like, I felt like I was in April when I read the chapter, but I checked, it's not April Fool's. You actually were today. So, but and part of what we also say in the chapter is that we compared with this system that we proposed with Bitcoin, in the sense that at the beginning, Bitcoin was also like a crazy April's idea, and people, kind of discounted it. And now it's, I guess, crypto and space nerds that are at the first initially getting discounted, until they grow so much that eventually there will be someone to trade to, even for those that still discount the idea. So I guess let's see whether we will actually have to say April Fool's Day, or whether other people may tip in. Okay, great. Thank you so much, everyone, for joining. Thank you, James. You're now 1 minute over your time. I know that you had a hard stop. I really, really appreciate it, and I hope to see you all very soon.